Good morning. I'm tremendously honored to be here, particularly because of the CUNY J School commencement speakers who have come before me, a list of journalism luminaries that I'm pretty sure I don't belong on. I feel like an itinerant singer-songwriter, somewhat popular on the open mic circuit, whose name just got called for induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But I'm happy to put on my graduation gown and come to your well-deserved celebration. The only thing that's missing is a tiara. They're all the rage, you know. I read recently that tiaras have been declared the new power scrunchies. And my source is the New York Times style section. So this is definitely a real phenomenon that is based on at least 3 examples. Because, as you know from your journalism education, it takes 3 to make a trend. I want to recognize Chancellor Milliken, Dean Bartlett, other honored guests, and the school's administration and faculty. And I want to congratulate the graduates, their families, and all of those who supported them as they worked toward the degree that you will get today. We all know that it takes a village to accomplish this goal, and I urge the graduates to say thank you today. Say it a lot, and to pay it forward in whatever way you can. It's common knowledge, I think I read it in the upshot, that most commencement addresses are largely and immediately forgotten. If a speaker is really lucky, he or she might be able to get one simple message across. I'm going to raise the bar here and go for 2, because CUNY-educated journalists are not your average graduates. My points are these: cultivate a growth mindset and never lose your independence. The first, if there's one thing that's been drummed into you here, it's that the world of journalism is changing at a breathtaking pace. I've been living in it and chronicling it right next door to you. When I arrived at the Times as public editor in September 2012, a little over 2 years ago, it felt like a newspaper with a strong digital presence. Today, the Times feels more to me like a true digital media company, one of whose flagship efforts is a printed newspaper. That's a big difference, and it's something with a trajectory that's not going to be reversed. As you know, it's not only at the Times that this change is happening. Consider some media organizations that didn't even exist a few years ago. This is Fusion, the Marshall Project, Policy Mike, now Mike, and Circa. Just that short time ago, the Graham family still owned the Washington Post. There was a newspaper called the International Herald Tribune, and the New Orleans Times-Picayune was still delivering its printed newspaper to people's doorsteps every day. How can you make your way in this crazily changing environment where the tectonic plates keep shifting beneath your feet? There's only one answer. You have to stay nimble and keep learning. You have to cultivate a mindset that's geared to growth, not fear. Some of that learning, maybe the most important parts of it, will come from your inevitable mistakes. Our business is a very tricky one. We are in a rush, publishing what's been called the first draft of history. And we're human, so we all mess it up sometimes. But it's how we handle those mistakes that matters the most. I'll give you an example from my experience. When I was the editor of the Buffalo News, a horrible crime happened in downtown Buffalo. There was a wedding party at a fancy restaurant, and it turned violent. A fight spilled out onto the street, and gunfire exploded. 4 people were shot and killed. 4 others were badly injured. All were African American. For several days, no one knew who the shooter was, and as a paper, we were trying to cover every angle and help to try to solve the mystery. Some people were trying to say that it was a random drive-by shooting. Amid all this, some of the best reporters at the paper turned up an interesting angle based on police records. Of the 8 victims, 7 had criminal records. 5 were convicted felons on charges like weapons possession, reckless endangerment, and armed robbery. As editor, I chose to take that story and display it at the top of the front page. I thought it said a lot about the nature of this event, about which so little was known, and that the story contributed to solving the mystery. After the story was published, many in Buffalo's Black community were enraged. Why would the paper pour salt in the wounds of the victims' families, they demanded. As it happened, the story ran on the day of one of the funerals, which only made the reaction worse. It turned into national news after a community activist started burning the newspaper in a trash barrel outside the newspaper building. I offered to meet with members of the community, and when I arrived at the church where the meeting took place, 700 very angry people were there to air their unhappiness in no uncertain terms. It was one of the toughest days of my life. And I can tell you that this hardened newswoman who had decades of experience as a reporter and editor under her belt ended the day in tears. The only thing that gave me much solace was the support I had from the members of my staff, many of them Black, who turned out to provide moral support and who took some of the brunt of the criticism themselves. What I learned was that whatever the news value of that story was, we needed to be much more sensitive in handling it. We needed to understand a community's point of view and the resentment that had built up long before my time toward media coverage. And we needed to provide more than lip service about going forward. It would require work and commitment. So we dug in. We did everything from creating a citizens advisory board on diversity to running training for top editors. I wrote about all of this later for Neiman Reports. And we made some progress. I later heard from a prominent Black minister that his faith in the paper had been restored and that he had announced that to his congregation from the pulpit. Here's an example of learning on a larger scale. I talked to Dean Baquet last week for my column that will appear in Sunday's paper. I asked the executive editor of the New York Times about the controversial practice of news organizations agreeing on occasion to hold back a story at the request of the government. He told me that in the wake of all that's happened after 9/11, including the recent torture report from the U.S. Senate, he is, quote, much, much, much more reluctant to defer to such requests. Is this in part because Edward Snowden took the government story of the decade to another news outlet? Mr. Baquet told me that it's unfortunate and was painful from a competitive standpoint that Snowden thought the Times was too pro-government to handle his revelations without buckling. Again, I'm quoting him, "I don't think we are that now." So that learning part of the equation isn't easy and it isn't painless, but it's worth it. What I have to tell you about independence also comes from my experience at the Times. At the moment, I'm privileged to have one of the oddest jobs in journalism. It is to help guard the journalistic integrity of what many people believe is the greatest news organization in America and one of the greatest in the world. In doing so, I'm often in the situation of investigating the very people who sit not far from me in the newsroom of the Times, and often writing about them, sometimes critically. When I took the job, I joked to my friends that this would be the ultimate lesson from the universe in how not to try to please everyone, or even anyone. It's often difficult and certainly awkward. The only thing that gets me through that tension is reminding myself that I'm not here to make anyone happy. I'm here to do a job as well as I can and stay true to my own beliefs and values. In other words, to be independent. In this world of commercial pressures, native advertising, shaky business models, and the uncertain future, if you can keep your independence and your authenticity, you'll be okay. The best reporters and editors I know are the ones who are beholden to no one except their readers and viewers and committed to playing it straight. Now I'm going to add a third and final piece of advice at the risk of really pushing my chances. This is really a request. As you find your way, and I know that you will, yes, there are jobs for you out there, and you are all very well prepared to find them and thrive in them. As you find your way, please do the most important work of journalism. Do the work that matters to your community and your country and your world. I read a story last week in Salon that reminded me of this. It was called The Six-Step Process to Dispose of America's Poor, and it detailed the ways in which far too many Americans are treated as expendable in our society, from unlivable wages to the shameful number of children in poverty, to a criminal justice system that clearly doesn't work. You might also find inspiration in the Times' Invisible Child series last year about a homeless girl in our city, or in the stories that are currently happening about the abuse of prisoners at Rikers Island. So if you're tempted to spend your time burnishing your personal brand, please resist it. Instead, do the work that really matters. Use your talents and whatever platform or outlet you have to represent the forgotten, to give a voice to the voiceless, and to hold powerful people and institutions accountable. So go on, take your growth mindset and your independence and use your newly honed journalistic chops to do what you're here for, change the world. Thanks for listening, and again, warmest congratulations.